We had one of the deadliest hurricanes in American history. And President Biden and Vice President Harris were down there meeting with local officials and comforting families, asking how they could help. And Donald Trump at a rally just started making up stories about the Biden administration withholding aid from Republican areas and siphoning off aid to give to undocumented immigrants. Just made the stuff up. Everybody knew it wasn't true. Even local Republicans said it was not true. And now the people of Florida are dealing with another devastating storm. And I want you to watch what happens over the next few days, just like the last time.
Hi, I'm Ana Marie Cox. This is 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. There are, deep breath, 24 days left before the election. There is still time to register in some states. So if you are not registered, you should, or don't know if you're registered, you should check your registration. Also, make a plan to vote. Vote early if you can. This is one of the most consequential elections ever. And we talk about it on this show. I talk to smart people about what they're thinking about this unprecedented, historic, wild, attention-grabbing election. And today, the smart person I'm talking to is Emily Atkin, the founder of Heated, the #1 climate publication on Substack.
Let's go.
Substack. I have complicated feelings about it. But people should subscribe to you because it's a form of independent journalism that they can't get elsewhere. It is also, I have a Substack that's like not really like for profit, but because it's the easiest newsletter to use. It's the absolute easiest. However,
well, it's also full of garbage. I mean, that's why it's like that's not necessarily cool to say over Substack.
So it's not just not cool, but like they do kind of like sort of support Nazis. Like they're Nazi adjacent in some ways.
Can I tell you something that really pisses me off?
Okay.
I was one of the first people on Substack. I
remember
in 2019 to start one, and back then it was cool, and it used to be cool to say like I have a Substack,
yeah,
and people would be like, "What's that?" And I'd explain, oh, it's this platform that like allowed me to become independent and break free from the traditional molds of journalism and support myself and finally know my worth as a writer and as a reporter and like finally connect to an audience and get that real community feel that I think was lacking in my sort of mainstream professional journalism jobs where I felt so connected to the masthead, but not to the people I was writing to. And then, and now it's like over the last couple of years, it's like, I'm like, yeah, I read a Substack. The one with that has the Nazis on it. Yeah.
Yeah. And the transphobes, and the vaccine deniers. And I get that, like, it's not quite the Nazi bar analogy. It's kind of like another analogy, perhaps. I know but I will say it's really hard to get off. And I think
once you've like established your entire livelihood on it, yeah.
And it may be more analogous to the ways that I'm probably never going to unsubscribe for the Times.
Right.
As much as I detest.
Well, I support the journalists of the Times, like.
And I support Jamel Bouie working there.
Yeah.
Right. Like also like friend of the pod, Elizabeth Spires writes for them. Like I've written for them, like, however, nightmare blunt rotation, as kids say. So they put out these are our election conversations.
Oh boy.
Okay. Ready?
Cool.
Alec Bernson and Chris Cuomo.
Cool.
Ben Domenech and Kamala Foster, who is a Black libertarian.
Okay.
Tulsi Gabbard and Jessica Reed Krause.
Wow. Okay.
Matt Taibbi and Marianne Williamson. Nate Silver and Matt Iglesias.
Do they have like anybody that represents like a progressive or leftist point of view that's not also like a little batshit?
And so I'm like, well, where is Charlotte Clymer and Parker Malloy?
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you know that one of your problems is that you platform transphobes, like,
Parker's like moderate libertarian and then conspirituality love fest.
and like these people who have now become like part of like the progressive to batshit grift,
Yeah. Ugh. That's what I meant
like
by conspirituality. Like, because I don't know if you've heard that term.
a great podcast. I don't know if do you listen to the Conspirituality
No, but I
podcast?
bought the book, which is still sitting on my nightstand. But
Podcast is really
I recently bought it. It's there.
yeah. So I don't know. Like, I mean, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism.
It's true. And you know what? I always get the reason I can also stay on Substack of the many that like I have to is that I can say that, my newsletter is the number one climate change newsletter on Substack. So like that's something, as it's and the reason that I take pride in that is not just because of an ego boost, but it's because there's a ton of like climate denialists and misinformation spreaders on Substack, which I really take issue with. Like such dickhead grifters are on that platform, and it makes me feel good to know that my Substack is doing better than their Substack at the very least.
Yeah, it's like it's also, Patreon has problems and, the only way to really have a marginally more like ethical, I mean, non-problematic, I don't even want to use the word ethical, right? Publication is to just go completely independent, which is really hard,
And
you
yeah,
know?
like and I've thought about it, but like I would have to build something, which is like totally out of my skill set. And so like I've talked to people, but it's difficult. And the other thing, like I said, is that like if I left Substack, right, then the number one climate newsletter would be someone saying that actually like it's better for the climate to have more fossil fuels, which is it's just so
Yeah.
incredible that shit.
Yeah. And I've also come to believe that there's kind of no ethical employment under capitalism, right?
Yeah.
There's no way to make money in capitalism where you don't support something kind of bad.
Some infrastructure um that is inherently harmful. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that you have a duty to do as much as possible to reduce that harm, but at the same time, like we're trying our best here.
Yeah, I just try not to judge. I encourage,
Yeah.
like I really hope that there is an alternative to Substack at some point that's as easy to use, right? I have gotten off of Twitter, but again, like do what you can, It's just a do what you can thing,
Totally.
right? It's not like I judge people for making different decisions, right? I I, I
I
I
judge
read a
people
really
for making
go ahead.
some decisions, but
What?
I said I judge people for making some decisions, but
Okay, sure. Like, but there are again, it's like all a hierarchy, though, right? Like, it's what decisions are you, and also there's a way that you have to be like, and I'm just gonna, if they've made a lot of decisions I disagree with, or like a big one that I disagree with, I can just choose not to associate with
yeah,
that person, right? I
yeah,
can choose to not platform them in my own platform. I mean, it's all, there is no ethical anything under capitalism. It's just like making individual ethical choices to the degree that you can.
yeah.
I am excited for anyone that can do an independent publication. So I'm just, you keep going,
It's
girl.
hard, but like working at a publication is also hard too in its own way. It's just like choose your difficult, choose your hard.
Choose your difficult path.
Mhm.
The stakes are high and the options are poor.
Yeah.
That is something of a saying we started to have on the show. Speaking of which, oh my God, that's a seamless transition.
Wow, yeah, it is actually.
Because describing the election is the thing that where that phrase came from. Now, I am excited, genuinely excited about some of the things on the Harris Walz side, right? Like adopted home state of Minnesota. Very proud to have gotten to vote for Walz, although at the time everyone thought he was a moderate candidate. However, especially when it comes to climate, like, what do you think? What are our options here?
I mean,
They're like really, really bad,
as
terrible. And then,
yeah, okay. So I like to sort of preface my thoughts sometimes when I'm talking about them to people as like I'm thinking about this as a journalist and as like somebody that is really more than anything gunning for political candidates for office to like tell the truth, right? I really want to see political candidates tell the truth. And when obviously I covered the first Trump administration, the whole thing, and I covered the election leading up to that. I covered the 2016 election. And so incredibly frustrating covering a Trump administration and campaign and all of the lies about climate change. And you just hope that when you're covering the other side, the Democratic side, that they will punch a hole in those lies and that they will tell the truth about climate change. And I think that what I've been so disappointed about with the Harris and Walz campaign is that they're not telling the truth about what needs to be done to effectively slow climate change on the campaign trail. Both of them in both debates have been bragging about the expansion of fossil fuels under the Biden administration and all of the expansion of fracking and gas that they're going to do. Now, we can compare that with the actual policies of the Biden administration, which are, I would say, mixed on fossil fuels, but that rhetoric is damaging. I don't think that people really understand how much like falsehoods about climate change and climate solutions have contributed to policy delay. So I understand that maybe what they're doing is, trying to appeal to a moderate base that thinks that phasing out or phasing down fossil fuels is like extremist for some reason. They're trying to appeal to people by, saying like, we're not going to get rid of oil and gas and actually we're expanding them and all that kind of thing, but it perpetuates a false idea that that's in line with solving climate change, which it's just factually not. So that as a reporter, that's what I'm most disappointed about watching this campaign.
I mean, like, we can point to policy in Minnesota, which I think it's been actually good, like ish, right? Like they're phasing out fossil fuels in the government in Minnesota, which Walz is supported. And one of the things that I've gotten excited by when they picked Walz is that he seems to be picked based on policy. Like Minnesota's not a swing state, and also that he's like an affable dad, sure, right? Like not going to discount America's dad vibes. I see exactly what you're talking about, and it is disappointing because I think what that rhetoric does is that it sends this message of like it's enough to recognize that climate change has happened, right?
Yeah.
That like that puts you on the side of the angels. That if you're just like, yeah, they're crazy, they're climate denialists.
What that assumes is that you can't be a climate denialist and say that climate change is real. There is a whole spectrum of things that you can deny about climate change after it's real. And what I see, in this campaign and in this political rhetoric is that we have both parties publicly denying that that fossil fuels are the problem. That and fossil fuels are 79% of emissions. And if we agree with the science that says that like we need to get to net zero by 2050, there's only one demonstrated way to do that. And it's you feel like a fucking crazy person when you are just someone who's trying to communicate the facts of what scientists are saying and and people are accusing you of being an activist for saying like, or being like a crazy radical activist for saying like, yeah, like the politicians are really dropping the ball by not talking about the need to phase down and out fossil fuels.
Yeah, I'm trying to come up with the right metaphor, but I think the other piece that's really damaging psychologically is that it transfers to say climate change is real, but then not advocate for serious policy shifts at the top at the like big place where they're happening, which is like corporate, industrial, fossil fuel use, right? If you say climate change is happening, but don't advocate for those big shifts in policy, what you're doing is transferring the responsibility to the individual, which seems huge and unbearable. And the like people like the Yale Center for Cultural Cognition and Climate Change has done like studies about like when people feel like it's like, oh, I have to recycle. Is that's what you're telling me? Okay. Okay. But it's incredible psychological burden.
And it's so dishonest to me.
Yes.
Like, it's just the real dishonesty that I feel about it when you'll say climate change is real, but not focus on the solutions that will actually make a difference. It's the dishonesty is in your desire to solve it.
Yep.
Right. I'm like, because I think that there's a legitimate, not even legitimate, but at least honest argument that I wish politicians were just making and saying when they're saying, like, yes, climate change is real, but I don't think it's in the best economic interest to solve it. Or I don't, or I would rather see those long-term effects than take the hit of the short-term, perhaps like bigger investment that I would have to make. Or
Right.
I think it's real, but I'm not going to get elected if I advocate for the solutions that scientists say is necessary. So I'm not going to do that. Like, Americans don't want it. So I'm not going to just at least be honest, stop pretending that your administration will completely solve this problem when it
Right.
just won't. But, that's.
And I just feel like I just get down to that psychological burden piece because I think that's where you also lose the political will. If you make it about individual people like doing small things. I mean, there are things I don't want to say don't do those things, right? Like we have enormous amounts of food waste in this country that again, you can just do. It's not going to make a huge effect individually, but sometimes I feel like doing some of the small stuff can make you feel better, like as a person. But if you think it's your responsibility to do something about climate change, that can lead to a convenient forgetting of the problem because it's such a big psychological burden that it just feels like too big to do anything. And then you lose the political will to make the kinds of changes that may not affect you personally, but that vested interests at the corporate level will not let happen.
Yeah, it's all a delicate balance. And I think, like, to what you're saying, it's also so much easier to make an individual choice and to keep pushing when you know that there's an infrastructure, a systemic infrastructure behind you that's also pushing for the same thing. So you feel like you almost like feel like you're in community, you're helping something move along rather than you're the only one behind this boulder pushing it. And so, yeah, I think like the rhetoric has really, just as a journalist, has disappointed me. But at the same time, there is like a balance between how frustrated I feel about the rhetoric and like what the two choices are and what the actual policy differences are of the two administrations. And I like understand that it's my duty to talk about those things.
I
No.
think it's Naomi Klein that said her vision for it has been to mobilize in the same way that Americans were able to mobilize in World War II, where there were both huge policy changes. And again, we can argue about whether or not wartime economies are good, good, right? But the sense of national urgency that was reflected at both like the individual level with people having victory gardens and doing like scrap collection around their neighborhoods and women not wearing nylons. That's one of my favorite things about that period is like women would draw lines back around on the back of their leg so it looked like they were wearing nylon. And then you also had like government shifts that we're all fighting the Nazis. We're
They're
all doing
working
this
together, right?
We're working together to fight the Nazis, and it's a winnable war if we work together, right? And that kind of mentality could be both psychologically empowering for individual Americans and individuals around the world, for that matter, and do the kinds of shifts that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally we all don't want to feel like we're alone in doing anything. Like we're all fundamentally looking for togetherness, community, and yeah, I think that kind of mentality is so appealing, like I think that it's so tempting to think about climate action also as like a disempowering thing, as like a thing that is hard to do and that you do on your own and that doesn't make you feel any better because the problem is just not moving at all. But that's not necessarily how it has to be. There are like tons of communities that you can feel like you're pushing that together. But it would really help if you felt like there was systemic um, action behind you. And there is to a degree, but when you know the extent of the problem, you're like, I really wish there was more.
So I wanted to have you on to talk about Helene and Milton, but we are talking about Helene and Milton, right? Like, and I could point to something directly, which is that there have been some studies. Rebecca Solnit wrote a really wonderful book that you remember the name of it, about the aftermath of Katrina, where she talked about the phenomenon that sociologists have studied, which is an immediate aftermath of the catastrophe. People are not disempowered; they are empowered. Like, there is a moment that people actually coalesce, right? Like, in the face of massive destruction, you see a community come together and help and have like mutual aid in a way that some of us like want to inspire all the time, right? Because we are actually constantly in front of a catastrophe now that I think about it. But um and I think you see some of that right now, right? However, it seems to me, and I'd be curious about your reporting on this and what you've seen, is one of the most powerful ways to disrupt that immediate aftermath where there is maybe some momentum for some kinds of policy change even, is to inject conspiracy theory into it.
Mm. Yeah. Well, that is the entire history of climate policy in the United States.
And that's what happened in Katrina, by the way. Like, if you look at what happened in Katrina, there was a moment of like, we are pulling together as a community and as a nation, right? And then there was like the looting and like FEMA camps. And I mean, it's all kind of based in, white supremacy and institutional racism. But, but this is the story of climate change, you're saying. This is the story of climate policy news.
The entire story of climate policy in the United States, ever since scientists first started like sounding the alarm about like climate change is happening, the burning of fossil fuels is disrupting our atmosphere. There's this incredible documentary that I think really explains this well. It's called The White House Effect. About It was right around the time when scientists first started sounding the alarm, and George H.W. Bush was in office, and he was like, wow, that's a crazy problem. We're going to combat the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. And the documentary shows all of the infiltrations and influence that happened to get H.W. Bush and the Republican Party off of that and into denial and into delay. And that and into questioning the science and into starting to like injecting conspiracy into mainstream dialogue about science and about like what the actual problem is. So there's been like different iterations of this, but essentially the purpose of it at all times is that when you, particularly after a disaster or after you get like big news and you're like, oh, we should act, that mobilization of people to find a solution is like incredibly threatening to the most profitable industries in our country and in the world, carbon creating industries, fossil fuel industries, but also chemical industries, transportation industries, anything that relies on the burning of fossil fuels to make money, right? So how do you how do you stop that momentum? Is that you have to inject uncertainty into what the problem is. If you can confuse people about what the problem is, then you confuse people about what the solution is. So it's just been literally 45 years of injecting whatever confusion you can put in to make it not be fossil fuels, to make it not be pollution, right? Industrial pollution, to make it not be carbon. Weather machines is just the latest one. And it's crazy because I felt like I should have seen this coming from a mile away because I've been like talking to I hear this in Ubers, like truly, because people will just ask me what I do for a living, and I'll say I'm a climate change reporter, and then so many times when it's just like a normal random person who's not in like my bubble of sphere, they'll be like, "Oh, what do you think about geoengineering?" And I'll start talking about it as if it's like, the actual subject of geoengineering. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I'll be like, "Oh, like, yeah, I think it's kind of fucked up. Like, I think it's and then they'll be like, "Yeah, I can't believe how much it's happening." I'll be like, what the fuck do you mean, dog?" Like, like it switches all of a sudden. They're like, "Yeah, I see it in the sky all the time, and I can't believe how much they're manipulating the weather." And I'm like, first of all, who? Who do you think it is? And number two, what? So like I've actually like just anecdotally felt this coming. And when it hit with Milton in particular, they're controlling the weather is these weather machines. And I was just like, I should have been prepared. I should have been prepared with this because it's been happening. But yeah, it's entirely predictable. It sucks.
It's predictable, and I guess as the social justice warrior I am deep inside, I just want to keep pointing out that the ways that it becomes especially insidious is when it draws upon existing racial, ethnic divisions. Who did they say are controlling those space lasers, Emily? When they say they,
Hey, yeah, who is that? They? I don't know. So I'm Jewish,
yeah,
and it's
you have no access. You didn't get the codes.
this like one of the things that I tell the people that are talking about this, and I'm like, well, number one, I can tell you, like, if I were controlling the weather, I would be doing it far differently. Um, but the craziest thing about it is that like there is a conspiracy to control the weather. Like there
But
are.
it puts powerful people on the wrong side of the conspiracy.
Yeah.
Right? It puts white people on the wrong side of wrong. It puts rich people on the wrong side of the rich non-Jewish people on the wrong side of the conspiracy. You know what I mean? Like I just feel like I want to articulate, like I see it because it is happening in this grotesque way now, but it feels to me like what's happened is there's been this confluence. It's not unique, but it's just really visible because we have one party that's running as fascists. This melding together of a more like denialist streak, right? A confusion about the causes to it is Jewish people that are causing this, and progressives who, when people use that word on the right, it is coded to mean that includes maybe gay people, maybe Black people. Also, this idea that refugees and immigrants have gotten the disaster money, right? Like it's just they figured out a way to take what is an existing truth about climate injustice, right? And just put it together, like climate denialism and fascism and bigotry, like
It's so
finally.
it's so difficult to respond
Finally.
to, like,
Yeah.
because so much of it is based in, like, tiny little truths. Like the geoengineering thing, right? Like, when we're starting to talk about I'm starting out to talk about geoengineering with, an Uber driver or something, and they're like, "So geoengineering is happening, right?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, like, they're studying it and, like, people do experiments, um, with cloud seeding or whatever, like solar radiation stuff, like, yeah, there are experiments happening." And then they're like, and then they take it to this crazy place that like has no evidence behind it, and it's very hard to you feel like a little crazy when you're like, "Oh, okay, um yes, but like, can we go back to the reasonable place?" You're fighting something that has just like ballooned out of control, and trying to explain like the nuance of the in between. people are just like, oh, I don't believe that, like, oh, so it's happening, but not that much, that it's so insidious. It's incredibly difficult. And that's like the number one reason, honestly, why I, as a reporter, am very um, scared of a second Trump administration, because that's the work I had to do for 4 years as a journalist. Was it it just completely changes the type of work you have to do. So it's like, I for 4 years, that's what I had to do. I had to just be like, okay, this crazy thing isn't true, and here's all the reason. Okay, this regulation has been repealed, and this is all of the effects of that. And it's so different than the work that I have to do now under a Biden administration, which is also not like, it's also deeply frustrating, but it's just a different kind of frustrating. There's like more nuance that I can get into. And sometimes like a good thing happens, right? Like sometimes progress is made. So there's at least like a breath that can be taken. Whereas like under a Trump administration, for my job personally, it's just like constant getting pummeled into the ground. You're never gonna have like a policy win, right? Like, so
Well, it's the difference between what's the best way to fight the Nazis, to go back to World War II, to are the Nazis bad? Do they
yeah.
exist? Like, who can say? Why don't you cover both sides of the Nazi? And this is also really where the metaphor gets really perfect, right? Like,
Yeah.
are the Nazis real? Can you cover both sides of the Nazi debate?
They did,
Yeah, I know what like that's sort of
They
the
did.
climate thing, right? Like and it's whereas with a progressive administration, you at least kind of have like, well, okay, Nazis exist. Fine.
It's just the fights that you want to be having is the difference between both. And like also there are, I mean, we haven't talked about this. There are tangible like emissions differences. Like I've written about this. It's like a 4 billion ton of emissions difference between the two administrations, because you got one that would repeal a bunch of existing policies and therefore like emit way more. And then one, even if they didn't, and then like the Democratic side, like even if they didn't implement any new policies, you're pretty much guaranteed they're not going to repeal the ones that previous Democratic administrations put in place. So like, and the thing about climate policy is that they tend to get more effective the longer that they're in place, right? That's like how carbon reduction works. You have to give the grants, and then the infrastructure gets built, and then the clean energy starts to generate. And then so like they need that length of time in order to be there. Like I get that it's kind of like a shitty choice, but like repealing all those things really sets us so far back. And it's like, I don't know if you've heard this metaphor, but I think it's really like a apt one. It's like it's trying to control a fever. That's what trying to control climate change is. It's like the fever has already risen to like a 99-degree fever, right? You can probably keep it under like 101 on one side, which is like, but then the other, you're like getting to a 104-degree fever, which is, sounds fucked up. You have a fever on both sides, but like you really don't want that 104. And
your brain starts to cook.
At least for the 101, an Advil might help you a little bit.
Right.
So,
yeah, and there's a metaphor, which is at 104, your brain starts to cook. So,
oh,
or I guess it's a little higher than that. At some point, your brain starts to cook. Fun fact. And that really, I think, gets to the climate metaphor pretty well, right? I was talking before about the ways in which the psychological burden of acknowledging climate change, if you put it on the individual, can make it so overwhelming that people kind of stop engaging, right? And they definitely kind of turn it into maybe something as easy as, well, I'm not a climate denier, right? Something that I'm always very curious to ask people who cover this for a living is the place where hope comes from and the place where the will to go on comes from. And I know you've probably answered this question. It can't be uncommon, but what is your thought on that? I mean, I asked Elizabeth Colbert once, and she's like, I just kind of don't think because she's like, I do my job, I do the reporting, and then like that's my life. Right.
Yeah.
So what's
Um,
it like for you?
I have a similar answer, but perhaps a more cheesy one. You ready?
I take cheese. I love cheese.
Me too. One of my
Yeah.
favorites. Um, I also don't really think of hope because I don't think that I personally need hope to do the right thing. I don't need a guarantee of a positive outcome to push for that positive outcome. Um, it it's not like I don't think that there is hope. I think like from a journalistic perspective, there are many scenarios, like scientifically modeled scenarios that put us in a better position than we're in right now. And so it's not about hope. I have proof, journalistic proof that there are scenarios and there are ways to push the public and push policy to reduce the amount of lives lost and reduce the economic cost and reduce the amount of refugees and reduce the amount of conflict. It's all there. It's not like a feeling for me, And so morally, as like a person that wants better outcomes, it I will push for those outcomes. I will say like it's the right thing to do to push for less deaths. I don't think that that's like an abdication of journalistic responsibility. I don't think that
Or
that's
bias. That's not
being
bias, you don't
biased, right?
think?
I think that that's like general moral, it's better to push for the thing that makes less people die, right? So that's just like a general level of moral uh ground that I think every journalist should have. I don't think that that's biased, right? So it's not about hope, it's about courage. And it's about like the courage to keep pushing for something that you think might not be guaranteed. No superhero in any superhero movie ever was just like, I'm only going to fight Thanos if I know I'm going to beat him, right? They go into it knowing that there's a big chance they're going to fail. What makes them so inspirational and what makes them, as a viewer that they're the good guys is that they don't need that guarantee. And they always have people around them that also don't need that guarantee. And that's like the type of community. And that's what really motivates me is that like, I want to be surrounded by people that will do the right thing and push for like the morally best outcome, no matter whether the guarantee is there. And also, this is another thing that really motivates me as a reporter that's covered fossil fuel industry denial and delay for so long. It's been like 11 years now. What I fundamentally understand about denial and delay is that it is designed to suck the life out of you so that you do not push for better outcomes. That's what confusion and delay is literally designed to do. You have like I've seen documents PR executives talking about how this will be the effect of inserting delay and denial into the conversation. It and that so for me, that's why, the newsletter is heated, it's anger, but because that pisses me off to know that like the purpose is to suck the will to act out of me and to suck the will to act out of everybody else. I'm like, oh, I'm not gonna let you do that. I'm not gonna let you. That's way more motivating to me than like, I hope it's gonna be good one day. That doesn't work for me.
I want to be clear about a couple things. One is that I don't think that Elizabeth Colbert was like, I was doing a little mocking, but also like I totally respect that I'm going to do my job. And it's not my job to, on my off hours, do the emotional labor of like trying to get people to have hope, right?
Oh, yeah.
And
I'm
that,
in that space too sometimes.
yeah, and that's totally like also not my job. I do think it's kind of my job to do a show like this that explores like the space of hopelessness and like how do you respond to hopelessness. But I have a lot of experience with hopelessness. Um, like as a person in recovery, a person who like deals with various mental illnesses. And my journey has actually been kind of similar. I'm not going to say I ever thought of myself as a superhero. I mean, maybe occasionally, and maybe now I'll use that metaphor. Um, but it's been to remember that hope is an action. Like, hope is not necessarily a feeling, right? Um, it is, you act out of hope when you take a chance on living today. Like, to survive through today and to act in community today, you may not feel hopeful, but like to me, that is what hope is. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean? Like you're summoning hope. You're not just hoping come for hope to come to you,
Yeah.
right?
It's an action
Like,
and it's not people. Well, I would say that people don't, it's not something that's like delivered to you. It is
yeah,
something that you have to seek, but sometimes I do think it can be delivered to you because you never know what is actually gonna give it to you. You know,
yeah,
eh, it's I have always, as a journalist, been like really obsessed with telling the stories of the bad guys. And then I
right.
get like comments from people who are like, hey, like, could you tell us something good that happened sometime? And I'm always like, that's not my job. My, like my job is to like uncover the muck, right? Like da 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 da. But what I've really actually realized is that um in addition to like informing people about the crappy things that happen, they also have to know how to like they can go fight, but for things to change. But if they don't know like examples of how things have changed in the past, then like they're not going to know what to do. So it's actually really important to tell those stories of like, here's how activists toppled this legislation to like expand coal use or something like that, or build a new coal plant. Like, here's how they did it, and that is actually like as because I'm not gonna like act like I have not experienced despair and hopelessness, not even just in the um, climate space, but just like in life in general. And the things that pull me out of it, like recently, I was feeling a lot of like despair and hopelessness just around like the field of writing as something that could bring
Oh,
as something that could bring me joy again because
yeah.
it used to, and I feel like writing just doesn't scratch that itch the way it was. And then my friend wrote a fiction book, and it's like she got this book deal, incredible book deal, and like she's just so happy about like how it's going, and it seeing that joy in her and that success in her like made me feel like okay, I know it's possible. Like I'm seeing that it's possible. And so sometimes I'm just saying that to be like sometimes people can deliver you hope in a way that you don't kind of expect, but
What I'm taking for this conversation is something that in all of the kind of stuff that I've had to do over the past few years to survive, I thought more about hope than I have about courage, but I think that that's a really good replacement word
yeah.
because courage is an action. Courage is associated with action, and courage is a thing that happens in the moment. Like, we don't know if we're courageous or not when things are just like, so we're just like hanging out. I don't know if you're courageous, and yeah, I think you are. Just, but,
Thanks.
but if you just meet someone, if you're just hanging out, like you don't know if they're courageous. You might actually get an indication if they're hopeful. Like that might come across. But courage only happens when you're faced with something. Like you only know that or can be courageous in the middle of something that's scary.
Yep.
So maybe the shift needs to be from like, oh, this is really dispiriting and I don't feel hopeful. And I'm just going to like, that's just really disempowering to, okay, I don't feel hopeful. Yep, I don't. Can I summon courage?
And I want to actually like um, credit the first person that gave me that idea of like transferring hope to courage. That it's this fantastic scientist that all your listeners should look up. Her name is Kate Marvel, which is so funny because her last
Should I
name,
have her on the show? Let me write that down.
yes, her last name is Marvel. Can you believe that?
Talk about also like no ethical consumption under capitalism. I fucking love Marvel movies, and talk about like consumption, fossil fuel consumption, like a blockbuster. I'm sure you know the numbers. Like blockbusters, to make a blockbuster, you're consuming you're putting out like 1,000, I don't know how many tons.
You know what's so incredible though is that if we just had a ton of renewable energy, like if our grid was powered mostly by renewable energy, then like things would making blockbuster films wouldn't emit as much carbon. Things emit a lot of carbon today because we use fossil fuels to power the things that make them work. There are obviously like huge environmental impacts to renewable energy development, clean energy development that need to be addressed. But one of the things that it doesn't do when it's being produced is emit shit tons of greenhouse gas emissions that warm the planet. So, like, that's also another thing that I just feel like is so important to like put out there is that transforming into a cleaner energy economy, into a clean net zero energy economy, it it means that like you get to keep stuff that's awesome, right? Like there's this narrative that I think is really sunk in that the right has done such a good job of infiltrating into people's minds that like climate action means you have to give up everything that you love. And I think that, again, to circle back to what we talked to earlier, those things are based in like a little bit of truth. Because, yeah, like in a sustainable and like a truly climate safe economy, yeah, you probably can't have like 17 cars or like, if it wouldn't be sustainable to eat beef at every meal. That's true. But like, or it probably wouldn't be sustainable to get like one day delivery packages every day. But like, is that hyper consumer economy really making you happy? Is it like, is that
I've
oh
been
no,
I've
like,
been conducting a couple years long experiment on this ever since I got divorced. So would you like to hear like just my experiment has shown that no, yeah, no. Like
right? Like there are changes that would have to be made, but like it's not like you're not gonna have Marvel movies. It's not like you can't have a hamburger. It's not like you can't have a car. Like there's just these massive exaggerations designed to make you not want to shift away from fossil fuels so that fossil fuel corporations can have all the money and they can be safe in their high on a hill houses while you all drown. So
yeah.
like I also think like that anger really motivates me, and also the understanding that like this has just been twinkling in
Sure,
my
I love it.
brain
Yeah. Sure.
recently that like if we actually transformed society into a climate safe uh like a climate safe economy, like it would probably necessitate transitioning away from like a hyper consumerist society, which would actually probably make everyone a lot happier. Like the saying touch grass, it would probably mean that we all touch grass a little more and don't go to Amazon every time we have a fucking problem in our
Yeah.
lives, right? Like that sounds awesome. That sounds like something I want for everybody.
And just such a good note to end on. So we are. I am writing down the name Kate Marvel, and she's the
Yeah.
person that introduced you to this idea of kind of changing our focus on hope to
Yes.
putting the emphasis on courage. Love it. You are Emily Atkin, the founder of Heated, the #1 climate publication on Substack, and I'm so proud of you. And I'm so proud. I mean, actually remember when you started it, and I was pretty safe in my sinecure at that point, but I remember knowing like this is what like the future is going to be.
Oh my God. That's so
Like,
cool.
well, I should have started my own. I had a little more faith and comfort in like what I was doing at the time. And I mean, like you, maybe I feel about what happened in journalism the way that you feel about seeing the conspiracy theories coming. Like the writing was on the wall about journalism, but
And you're like, why didn't I?
got this show. You know what? Incredibly smooth segue. Hey, if you are enjoying this show, like, subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends and neighbors, vote for us in the Signal Awards, which do have like a People's Choice aspect to them. We're a finalist up against a lot of um, more Bigfoot, and by that Bigfoot, I do not mean a what did they call the client? Crypto cryptids. I don't mean cryptids. I mean MSNBC. That's what I mean. Up against very large legacy media podcasts. So vote for us in Signal Awards. If you're listening to this podcast, it's available on YouTube, youtube.com/@ 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox, and the 90 Days with a 9. If you are watching this on YouTube, it's also available as a podcast. Again, vote for us on Signal. And that is vote.signalaward. No, Signal Award. That is vote.signalaward.com. This has been 90 Days with Ana Marie Cox. I'm going to start making it like Jaws. 24 days until the election. It won't be over then. Speaking of courage, know that that's coming. Know that the fight's not going to end after Election Day. Who knows what it'll look like. And we will be back next week. Thanks for listening / watching.
Hurricane Milton's strength and magnitude have left veteran meteorologists in shock, including John Morales of Miami. Take a look.
Just an incredible hurricane. It has dropped It has dropped 50 millibars in 10 hours. I apologize. This is just horrific.